Hi, I'm Paul Nguyen, Director of Education at BlueHour Photo Ventures. Thanks for joining me for another tutorial on editing your photos to give them that punch and distinctive style that you're looking for. I'm going to be teaching you about layer masks, which are, in my opinion, the most uniquely useful feature of Adobe Photoshop. They can be difficult to understand if you've never used Photoshop before, so this tutorial will hopefully make things clearer and less intimidating for you. Once you understand masks, you essentially understand Photoshop. In order to get the most out of this tutorial, make sure you've watched Lauren's lesson on editing raw files and my lesson on adjustment layers. If you know how to use adjustment layers and you understand the difference between adjustment layers and pixel layers, the next step is using layer masks to either confine your edits in an adjustment layer to just a specific region of your photograph or to define which parts of a pixel layer are visible. Layer masks are like masking tape when you paint. Masking tape allows a certain area to be painted while protecting another area from being painted. In digital photo editing, you might use layer masking to brighten just one part of your image while keeping the rest of it dark. This tutorial is divided into two parts. In part 1, I'll teach you how to use masks on adjustment layers, and in part 2, I'll show you how to use masks on pixel layers. Let's open an image that we've already been working on in Adobe Photoshop Creative Cloud. This image is your typical Photoshop file that has your photograph as a pixel layer on the bottom, and on top of that are several adjustment layers that work together to affect the look of your image, without actually changing the original image in any way. All these adjustment layers affect the image globally, meaning that the effect is applied to the entire image as a whole. But what if I wanted to create an edit that only affected one small part of the image? Well, that's where I would use a mask. Let's say that I just wanted to brighten just this area of the image, the driftwood branch, while keeping the rest of the image looking as it is. Let me create a curves adjustment layer on top that I intend just for brightening this area. So I click on the top layer to highlight it, and then click here to add a new curves adjustment layer, which is added on top of the layer I just highlighted. Since I know I want to restrict this adjustment to just one area of the photo, I'll add a mask to this layer by going to the Layer menu, selecting Layer Mask and Reveal All, or simply clicking on this mask icon at the bottom of your Layers palette. You'll see a white box appear next to your adjustment layer, which represents your mask. A mask has two basic properties. It either reveals the contents of the layer that it's placed on, or it hides the contents of the layer it's on. When a mask appears white, that corresponds to reveal, meaning it's showing the contents of the layer. And when the mask is black, that corresponds to hide, meaning it's not showing that layer. So a layer with a completely white box next to it is completely revealed or shown, which means you can see all of it. To switch a mask between black and white, you can press Ctrl-I, which inverts the mask. So when I set my curves adjustment to brighten this image, since the mask is all white, the brightening is applied across the whole image. However, if I want the adjustment to be applied to only the driftwood, I would want to make the mask white over just the driftwood to reveal the effect on the driftwood, while being black over the rest of the image that I want to keep unaffected, so that the effect is hidden from the rest of the image. To do this, I want to either paint black onto the mask to hide the adjustment from the rest of the image aside from the driftwood, or make the mask black and paint white onto the mask to reveal the adjustment on just the driftwood. To minimize the amount of painting I need to do, because the area I want to adjust is small, I'll just make the mask black by pressing Ctrl-I and paint the small area white that I want to reveal. Select the Paintbrush tool by pressing the B key on your keyboard, or going over here to your Tools palette and selecting the paintbrush. Make sure that white is your foreground color here. The color square that's on top represents your foreground color. The two color choices here are white and black, and you can switch white and black as your foreground and background colors by pressing X on your keyboard, or the little white arrows right here. If the colors you see here are ever anything other than black and white, you can always set them back to the default black and white by pressing the D key on your keyboard. So I've selected white, and now I'm going to paint white onto my mask. I click on the mask box, so now I know I'm working on the mask. I adjust the size of my brush to be appropriate for the area I'm painting, and I set my brush hardness to 0 to get nice soft edges on my brush strokes. I can also adjust the size of my brush by pressing the bracket keys on my keyboard. Left bracket to decrease my brush size, and right bracket to increase it. Then I go to the area I want to reveal the adjustment in, which is the driftwood, and I paint onto it with my brush. As you do this, you'll be revealing the adjustment onto the part of the photo that you're painting, like magic. Remember, since I clicked on the mask box earlier, I'm actually painting white onto the mask right now, and I'm not actually painting anything onto my actual image. And if I look at the little mask box in my layers palette, I'll see that the part of the mask that I painted on is now revealed. I can fine-tune the adjustment now to suit the brightness I'm looking for. I can also fine-tune the edges of my masked area by changing the size of my brush and painting black back into the areas where I might have gone too far with my first pass. And I can do this again and again until my mask is as precise as I need it to be. I can also see the mask superimposed onto my image by pressing the backslash key on my keyboard, which shows the areas hidden by the mask as red and the revealed areas as transparent. Precise masking sometimes entails zooming into your image at high magnification or even 100% magnification to really get a close look at the boundaries of your mask. Masking doesn't have to be all or nothing, as in part of the layer is either revealed or hidden. By lowering the opacity of your brush by varying degrees, you can paint various shades of gray onto your mask. Gray is neither black nor white, so that means it's neither revealing completely nor hiding completely the adjustment layer in that region of the photo. It's doing something in between. So as I paint black onto the white part of the layer with a reduced opacity brush, you'll see that part of the mask turning gray. And the effect created by the adjustment layer is reduced in that part of the image. These reduced opacity brushstrokes are cumulative, in that if I let go of the mouse button and then paint over the same part again, I'm painting gray on gray, which makes the gray darker and reduces the effect of the adjustment even further. Press the backslash key and you'll see the different opacities of your mask represented as different densities of red. Masking works for all kinds of adjustment layers, including if I want to increase the color saturation in only one part of my image, or boost the contrast of just the sky, for instance, and not the foreground. Practice using masks with all the different adjustment layers that you normally use. At first, masking can seem like a complicated process, but as you use this technique over time, it will really become second nature to you. In this part of the tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can use masks on pixel layers. My favorite application of masking pixel layers, or layers that contain actual image data, is when I've taken several bracketed shots of a high contrast scene, such as shooting into a sunrise, where I can't capture the entire scene in one image without either blowing out the sky or leaving the foreground as a dark silhouette. And so I have one shot that is the correct exposure of just the sky, and one shot that is the correct exposure of just the foreground. My goal is to combine the two shots in such a way that I would use the sky from the first shot and the foreground from the second shot. One way to do this is with, you got it, a mask. If you choose to combine your photos in this way, make sure you captured your different exposures with your camera on a tripod. That way you know that your images will line up perfectly with one another. From Adobe Bridge, I choose the two photos that I'm going to combine. The first photo is my sky exposure. You can see that the sky is correctly exposed with good saturation and hue, but the foreground is too dark to use. The second photo is my foreground exposure, where the bottom part of the shot is correctly exposed, but the sky is just way too bright. I open both images into Photoshop. If I made these shots in RAW format, then I have the opportunity now to edit both shots in Adobe Camera Raw prior to opening them in Photoshop. Let's assume I'm done with RAW editing, and I'll just go straight to Photoshop. The two images open in different workspaces, so I'm going to drag one image so that it sits on top of the other image, and the two images will exist as two layers in the same Photoshop file. Select the Move tool by pressing the V key on your keyboard or choosing it in the Tools palette. Click and drag this image onto the tab for the other image. Then, move your cursor over the other image and hold the Shift key while you release your left mouse button. Holding the Shift key as you release ensures that the top image automatically lines up perfectly with the bottom image. Now you have both images as separate layers in the same Photoshop file. Since the image that you dragged over to make the top layer has been copied to this file, you can go ahead and close the original version of this image without saving. The order of layers doesn't really matter here. You can either have your sky exposure on top of your foreground exposure, or the other way around. That's your preference. Here I have my proper sky exposure on top of my proper foreground exposure. Normally, when you put one image on top of the other image with no masking or changes to the blending mode, you'll only see the image that's on top. Turning off the visibility of the top layer allows me to see the bottom layer. In order to combine the proper exposure of the foreground, which is on the bottom, with my proper sky exposure on top, I create a mask on the top layer by selecting the mask icon in the Layers palette or going to the Layer menu, Layer Mask, Reveal All. This creates a white mask that's associated with my top layer. Choose the Brush tool and select a suitable brush size with a hardness of 0 as I showed you in part 1 of the tutorial. I select black as my foreground color. Remember, black is the color for hiding the contents of a layer. I click on my mask, which means now I'll be painting on the mask, not on the image layer itself. I paint black onto the white mask over the part of the top image layer that I want to hide, which in this case is the underexposed foreground. By hiding the foreground in the top image layer, I'm allowing the foreground from the bottom image layer to show through. I can be as precise as I need to be by zooming in really close, by changing the size of my brush, and really being exact. And if I accidentally go too far, I can undo the last brush stroke, or I can switch to white as my foreground color and correct my black brush strokes. Precise masking takes skill and practice, and a detailed masking job of a tricky photograph can sometimes take hours depending on your patience level and how perfect you insist on being. I've skipped forward to the finished version of this mask, and you'll see how we've now created a single, more pleasing image by masking two different layers together that had different exposure values. When editing an image, you can use masks on both image layers and adjustment layers. If you choose to bracket your exposures as I do, you should start by combining your different exposures with masks to create one good base image, as I just showed you here. And then you can proceed to add adjustment layers on top of this image to make it look even better. There's really no substitute for masks as far as being very specific in how your image is edited. Masking is a skill that takes practice to get good at, and it might be the last remaining skill in photo processing that actually requires precision and patience, because every other part of digital photo editing is really just moving a bunch of sliders up and down. So the trademark of great editing, in my opinion, is great masking. I'm Paul Nguyen of BlueHour Photo Ventures. Thank you for joining me in this tutorial.